welcome everyone. It is a great pleasure today to be able to welcome someone who I've known for a great many number of years. That is Ramon Pacheco Pardo, who is a lecturer, a senior lecturer, or rather even a reader at King's College London. He's in the Department of European and International Studies, and Ramon and I go back a number of years. We were at LSE together doing our PhDs. I think we overlapped. I think I was near the end when Ramon was at the beginning. And since then, he stayed in London and I left. So that's where our pathways have diverged. But we've seen each other from time to time in various conferences, and it is a really, really great pleasure for me today to be able to introduce him to you. He is going to talk for about 35, 40, 45 minutes, I guess, on his research, which has been ongoing. Those of you who've been here in the room a little while will have heard us chatting about it just moments ago. This is a continuation of really a work that's been going on for over a decade, where he's been looking at the extent to which North Korea is able to achieve one of its longest term foreign policy objectives, which he will tell you about, and the extent to which perhaps, and this is what I find really interesting, North Korea is at one time seen as being a complete sort of an anomaly in almost every regard in terms of its political position in the global system. But at the same time, there are very strong lessons to be learned to do with how small states deal with big powers and large powers, which he will, I guess, talk about, and if not, maybe elaborating. So I'm going to, and I should say, I recommended to Ramon that he doesn't use a PowerPoint. He's just we're going to see him, because obviously on Blackboard, as soon as we move to slides, we become almost invisible and the PowerPoint takes over and dominates. So what we will do is I will pass the mic to him. He will obviously present, giving us his insights. And then afterwards, the floor will be open for discussion and for questions. I think we'll do as normally. You can always contribute via the chat. And depending on how big we are and how much time we have, we'll talk about opening mics and so on. But in the first instance, please communicate through the chat, and I will either voice those questions or we can talk about letting mics be open. But I will now mute myself. Over to Ramon, and please take it away.
Thank you, Robert. And yeah, as you said, pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And yeah, I think when I joined the LSE program, you still had like a year and a half left from what I recall, actually. So you were kind of a mentor back then. And hopefully after the pandemic is over, we can meet again. And I can go to Barcelona again, which I haven't been able to go for like 3 years or so now. This presentation that I'm going to be doing today actually is based on research that has been going on for some 14-15 years. It goes back to my PhD years, but there have been 2 more iterations of research since then, including 2018-2019, so right before the pandemic, when I was able to conduct more interviews with policymakers. But it's also based on what we would call, I guess, from an academic perspective, participant observation, in the sense that I've been part of track 1.5 and 2 dialogues with North Korea and other countries in the region, such as South Korea, China, Japan as well, where we discuss this type of matters. So there is the academic component to the presentation, and also, I guess, the policy-oriented component. And I'm going to divide it into 2 different parts. The first part is going to focus on what does North Korea want, in as much we can answer this question, which is the research I've been looking into really since 2006, when I joined the PhD program first. And the second part, which maybe is more policy-oriented, how can the international community deal with North Korea, address its concerns, its goals, and try to achieve a satisfactory outcome from the perspective of the US, South Korea, etc., which would be for North Korea to denuclearize, which remains the main issue when it comes to the international community engaging with North Korea. So the starting point, what does North Korea want? And the argument that I make in my book and a couple of articles based on interviews, I should also say based also on interactions with North Koreans, is that North Korea's long-term goal has been normalization of diplomatic relations with the US. This goes back to the 1970s when we had the famous visit by Nixon to China and the rapprochement process between the US and China, and later on, obviously, European countries, Japan as well. They also established diplomatic relations with China. And at that period in time, the two Koreas had the first ever meeting since the Korean War, 1972. And in 1974, North Korea sends a letter to the US. North Korean Congress sends a letter to the US Congress asking for the establishment of diplomatic relations between the two, putting them in the context, of course, of the rapprochement process between the US and China that I mentioned before. And at this period of time, of course, we were towards the end of the Vietnam War. So the big war between the US and a communist country, a hot war I'm talking about, not cold war, was coming to an end as well. This didn't happen, but what we see in the 1980s, in this competition that you had between the two Koreas during the Cold War, is that South Korea, so to speak, is going to win the competition because communist countries are actually going to establish diplomatic relations with South Korea. We're going to see countries in Eastern Europe, such as Hungary, Poland. They established diplomatic relations with South Korea. They wanted South Korean investment. Soviet Union does the same in 1990. And in 1992, China also establishes diplomatic relations with South Korea, which is seen as a big betrayal by North Korea, but also from the Pyongyang's perspective, is another reason why the US might be willing to establish diplomatic relations with itself, right? Once South Korea and China have established diplomatic relations, the Cold War in Northeast Asia, so to speak, from a North Korean perspective, is over. So it is possible to establish diplomatic relations with the US, which of course didn't happen. It didn't happen, but it is true that in 1994, the Clinton administration is going to be the first one to sign an agreement with North Korea in which it is going to agree to diplomatic relations with North Korea, to the exchange of liaison officers as a step towards diplomatic normalization through the establishment of embassies in Pyongyang and in Washington, D.C. This is not going to happen, but then you're going to see that every single US president since then has signed an agreement with North Korea in which normalization of diplomatic relations is included. So this happens with Bush in 2005, Obama in 2012, and then Trump in the famous Singapore summit of 2018. All of them have agreed to this. This hasn't happened, and I will talk about why in a second. But first, why does North Korea want diplomatic relations with the US? Well, there are three main reasons. A, it wants recognition as a normal state, and there are only 4 countries in the world that don't have diplomatic relations with the US. One of them is Iran, and we can all understand why. Another one is Syria, actually, due to the US supporting the fighters, the non-independent fighters, the anti-Assad regime fighters in the country. And the other one is Bhutan, because it has a policy of not establishing diplomatic relations with any of the P5 in the UN Security Council. So North Korea is part of a very small group of countries that have really failed in terms of foreign policy in one of the big goals that every country would have, which is having diplomatic relations with the biggest and most powerful country that we still have today. Second reason, because without diplomatic normalization with the US, North Korea will remain a poor country. And this is because many international investors don't want to touch North Korea. And this is not only because of the sanctions regime, this is also because of the political problems that it has with the US. So no American investors want to invest in North Korea, no European investors want to go to North Korea, same for most Western countries, Canada, Australia. So there's the economic problems, there are economic problems that come from North Korea not having diplomatic relations with the US. And thirdly is competition with South Korea. South Korea today has diplomatic relations with every single country in the world, with the exception of North Korea itself and Taiwan, because of the reasons that we all know, the isolation of Taiwan, right, that most countries in the world practice, but still there is an economic liaison office with Taiwan, right? So really North Korea is the only country in the world with which South Korea doesn't have any sort of diplomatic relationship. at least on a sustainable basis. And in the case of North Korea, well, it has lost the competition. It doesn't have diplomatic relations with the US, doesn't have diplomatic relations with Japan either, which is a big problem for North Korea too. Now, other than that, what is North Korea trying to achieve? Obviously, the nuclear weapons program that we all know about, which is nothing new. It goes back to the 1960s. And it's interesting, when North Korea started to develop the nuclear weapons program, it was a reaction to two developments. South Korea and Japan being under the US nuclear umbrella. So the US guaranteed that South Korea and Japan would be protected against Chinese and Soviet potential nuclear strike with its own nuclear umbrella. But secondly, because China and the Soviet Union had developed their own nuclear weapons. And North Korea was dependent on these two countries economically and for its security. We saw it during the Korean War. Without Chinese intervention, North Korea wouldn't exist today. And without Soviet support, North Korea wouldn't exist today. The US and the United Nations would have been able to defeat North Korea. North Korea had its Chuchi ideology, independence ideology. It didn't want to be dependent on any other country. And a nuclear weapons program was the perfect way not to be dependent on China or the Soviet Union in case there was a future war with the US. Fast forward to the 1990s, North Korea is developing the nuclear weapons program, but is really underdeveloped by the late 1980s, early 1990s. And in the 1990s, we see the collapse of communism, including in the Soviet Union. Plus, obviously, even though it hasn't collapsed in places such as China and Vietnam, it is true that we have a different economic model in these two countries. These two countries have opened up. They are embracing capitalism. So from a North Korean perspective, even the remaining communist countries, with the only exception of Cuba, actually, the remaining communist countries have betrayed communism, so to speak, because of their economic policy. So what do we see here? We see that North Korea doubles down on the nuclear weapons program. This is a very auspicious time for North Korea because Pakistan, as you all know, is developing the weapons program. Is going to have its first test in 1998, and Aga Khan, who is the main nuclear scientist directing the Pakistani nuclear weapons program, is willing to sell technology and to sell expertise. So Pakistan is going to sell its expertise and technology to North Korea, not sanctioned by the Pakistani government as far as we know, but North Korea is going to dramatically improve its nuclear weapons program. And North Korea, from the 1990s onwards, is going to see a nuclear weapons program as the only way really to avert a possible invasion from the US or possible collapse. Many communist countries were collapsing because of internal revolt, right? If we look at Central Eastern Europe, the changes came because people were demanding a change in political system, right? Places such as Eastern Germany, Romania, etc., etc. And North Korea feared that the same could happen there, right? And if there was an internal revolt, of course, South Korea, the United States, Japan, might feel that they want to support the revolt through military intervention. So North Korea wanted to avoid this. And North Korea is going to continue to develop its nuclear weapons program in a clandestine way. And then we're going to see the Bush administration coming to power. Now, this is going to be key. This is going to be key because the Bush administration is going to show that sometimes the US is actually willing to engage in regime change. Right? Throughout the 1990s, we all thought that with the so-called victory of liberalism, right, and we had a famous book by Fukuyama, right, that the great powers would not intervene in the smaller powers that they had been doing during the Cold War. But then along comes Bush, and of course we have 9/11, and shortly after 9/11 we have the invasion of Afghanistan, but later on also the invasion of Iraq. And from a North Korean perspective, and this is something that's very interesting because if you look at North Korean media, but you also talk to North Korean officials, this is something they always go back to. They say we had an agreement in the 1990s with Clinton, normalization in exchange for denuclearization, but along came Bush. It is true that he tore apart the agreement. He made clear that he wasn't happy with it, but furthermore, the US invaded a couple of countries. Later on, of course, Libya signed an agreement with the US in which it agreed to dismantle its weapons of mass destruction, but then Gaddafi was removed from power. So yet another reason for North Korea to want to keep a nuclear deterrent. North Korea also mentions the case of Ukraine, right? Russia invading part of Ukraine. So from a North Korean perspective, that's also another reason why a weaker power, North Korea in this case, needs to have nuclear weapons. And then it also talks about Yemen, for example. Look at Yemen, right? You can even have a regional power such as Saudi Arabia engaging in war, waging war in another country, right? So from a North Korean perspective, we are back in the wilderness, so to speak, of the Cold War, in which great powers could decide that they're going to invade part of another country or they're going to engage in regime change. Therefore, it needs to have a nuclear deterrent. This is the only way to avoid potential US intervention. But having said that, and going back to the point that I made before, North Korea is a poor country, and proliferation of nuclear technology, which is something that North Korea has been doing since the 1980s, but especially since the 1990s, 2000s, is a way for the North Korean regime to raise funds. So we do know that North Korea has helped to develop nuclear reactors or has transferred nuclear technology or expertise to countries such as Egypt, Libya, Syria, Iran, Myanmar as well. So not only countries in the Middle East region, so to speak, but also beyond the Middle East region, right? There are suspicions that they have also done the same in Sub-Saharan Africa, places such as Nigeria, for example, even though we are not certain about this. But we do know that in Egypt, Libya, Syria, Iran, proliferation has actually happened from North Korea. And we do know that in some of the nuclear tests that North Korea conducted, like 2006, 2009 later on, apparently there were, or we have great certainty that there were Iranian nuclear scientists and government officials witnessing this, right? The other reason why North Korea wants the nuclear weapons program is because if you compare the two Koreas today, in every single measure, South Korea is more powerful, economically, culturally, of course, it's a democracy, so politically as well. Even militarily, the South Korean military is much more advanced than the North Korean, and of course has the alliance with the US, right? The only advantage that North Korea has is the nuclear weapons program, right? So in this inter-Korean competition that I've been referring to, North Korea believes that this is the advantage that it should keep, because North Korea, A, by law, cannot become a nuclear power, right? Because this goes against international law, but B, it has the agreement with the US, so it is under a nuclear umbrella, and be right, if South Korea decided to develop its nuclear weapons program, it wouldn't have the moral ground over North Korea anymore, right? So today South Korea can have the moral ground because it's a democracy, it's much more open to the world, etc., etc. But what happens if it goes against international law and against the US alliance and develop its nuclear weapons program? Well, morally, South Korea wouldn't be superior to North Korea anymore from this perspective. So this matters for North Korea, that it has something that South Korea cannot have. It also matters, of course, because there are only the 5 recognized nuclear powers in the world, plus the 4 others, right? Pakistan, India, North Korea, and Israel, which I think we all know has its secret nuclear weapons program, right? So it's only 9 countries in the world that have become nuclear powers. So from North Korea also that matters as well, right? It's in this very select group. Third goal that North Korea wants to pursue, which is very pertinent to the current regime, the Kim Jong-un regime, the third Kim that has ruled North Korea, which is economic development. There is a discussion as to why North Korea wants to develop its economy. I think there is a general agreement that one of the reasons is obviously to strengthen the Kim regime, right? So you are a rich country, therefore there won't be internal revolt. And those of you who have studied the Arab Spring, for example, you know how poverty and economic underdevelopment led to the revolt, right? So for North Korea, this was one of many wake-up calls, right? Because for North Korea, for example, communism in the 1980s, 1990s also collapsed, not necessarily because of the political system, but because economically, right? For example, Eastern Germans, the standard of living wasn't as good as Western Germans, or Eastern Europeans, the standard of living wasn't as good as Western Europe, right? So this economic underdevelopment. So for North Korea, this actually matters, right? It's a way to preserve the Kim regime But on top of that, if you look at North Korea, it is surrounded by three of the biggest economies in the world: China number 2, Japan number 3, and South Korea number 10. So really, if there is one region where you would want to be based to become a developed economy, really Northeast Asia, probably along with Europe, would be the perfect one, right? Because you have, as I said, 3 of the 10 biggest economies in the world, and Taiwan is also nearby, one of the top 15, 16 economies in the world as well, right, depending on the measure. So really for North Korea, the fact that it is poor in a rich region, because this is a very rich region, right, is also one of the reasons why it sees potential for economic growth. It wants to match the level of development, at the very least, of China, and maybe not South Korea, Japan, that are more developed today, but at the very least, the level of economic development of China, right? So until the 1970s, you probably know this, North Korea was the richest of the 2 Koreas, right? Following the occupation by Japan and the Korean War, traditionally, the northern part of Korea was where industry was based. The southern part was the agrarian Korea, so to speak, right? So the little industry that was left was in North Korea. So North Korea, with the support of China and the Soviet Union, in spite of the Chuchi ideology, right, is going to result of support from the communist camp. By the 1970s, by the early 1970s, is richer than South Korea, right? But this is still largely agrarian and with little industry. From the late 1970s onwards, though, South Korea is going to become richer thanks to industrial development, and from then on, the differential is going to grow exponentially, right? So North Korea actually remembers a past when it was a rich country by developing country standards. If you compare North Korea in the 1970s with, let's say, Central Eastern Europe, or if you compare it with Latin America or the Middle East, North Korea was among the most developed countries, among these non-aligned movement countries, so to speak, because North Korea joined the non-aligned movement also in the late 1970s, right? It was part of them, right? It was part of this group of countries that didn't want to be part of East and West if they could choose, right? And it was among the most developed of them. So it remembers its past and the past glory. But it also knows, and this is something that if you talk to North Korean officials, it's not that they are not aware of this, right? They do know that today North Korea can't compare with South Korea, but also that it cannot even compare with China, right? And this is something that North Koreans know. North Korean officials, they visit China. Chinese officials visit North Korea. North Koreans cross the border with China, and you know, as soon as they cross the border, they realize, well, we live in a poor country compared to a former communist ally, right, or to a communist ally that used to be as poor as we are, and it's not anymore, right? So there is this thinking on the part of North Korea that because of the glorious past, so to speak, we should become, it's possible to become rich again, right? In the 1990s, with the collapse of communism, the economic lifeline provided by the Soviet Union and China to North Korea disappears. We have what North Koreans call the Argos March, or the Great Famine, in which over a million, at least over a million North Koreans die of hunger. Some people say up to 3.5 million people died of hunger or hunger-related disease in a country of 20 million, so we're talking about 10% of the population. So really, this is one of the biggest humanitarian disasters we have had in recent times at a global level, not only in North Korea, right? And what you see since then is that North Koreans have to find a way to survive. And this is the beginning of a market economy in North Korea, not officially recognized by the state, right? At least in the beginning. I'll get back to this later on. But we see the beginning of a market economy, the so-called Changmadan. And North Koreans start to work in the markets, right? And in the 2000s, another reason why North Korea wants to develop its economy is because of recognition of the existence of these markets that the state wants to control, right? So they are officially acknowledged in 2002, not as separate entities. The markets are considered to be part of the state economy, but the state in July 2002 introduces economic reforms. The government introduced economic reforms similar to those introduced by China in the 1970s and 1980s, which are recognition that North Korea is moving towards a market economy, right? And then you have Kim Jong-un coming to power in December 2011, when his father passes away. And he pushes the so-called Pyongyang line, which means parallel development, which is development of the nuclear weapons program along with the economy. And he starts to recognize markets officially. They are officially sanctioned, the markets. Among other reasons, because the government wants to tax the markets, right? So there are economic reasons why it's doing that. But this is an important ideological change in North Korea. And actually, North Koreans, the official version that North Koreans give in private as to why they have markets, they say, well, this goes back to the independence years when we were fighting against Japanese colonialism. And Koreans, obviously, back then not North Koreans, came up with the markets as a way to resist the official economy, right? So we have this recognition under the current regime. And if you look at this market economy from a North Korean perspective, it is setting up the conditions for investment into the country. So there are tourism resorts, there are markets, there are all these principles of a market economy. Obviously, still with a strong state intervention, but eventually it would be possible to have investment. So now I'm going to focus for the next 10 minutes or so, 5-10 minutes, so I don't go over time, on the second part, which is if these are the three goals that North Korea wants to achieve: normalization of diplomatic relations, nuclear deterrent, plus economic development, what can the international community do to try to achieve its goal of the denuclearization of North Korea? Because even though you know, the Biden administration, many other countries, they talk about improving the human rights of North Koreans, involved in these discussions with policymakers on one side, from the other, it is obvious that the key goal continues to be for the US, the international community, denuclearization. South Korea is different because the other goal, of course, is reconciliation leading to reunification. But you know, human rights is really secondary for many governments, right? And denuclearization is really what they want. So what we saw during the Obama administration and more clearly during the Trump administration, until the summit in Singapore, was pressure. So sanctions from the UN Security Council on North Korea date back to 2006. US, European, meaning EU, and Japanese sanctions also date back to the late 2000s. South Korea has also been imposing sanctions on North Korea since the 2013, so 7-8 years ago. So North Korea is under this huge amount of sanctions coming from the international community and from other countries individually. The rationale is not regime collapse, as policymakers always say, but that sanctions will force North Korea to come to the negotiation table to give up its nuclear weapons in exchange for sanctions relief and obviously aid, investment, trade, etc., right? So all the economic goodies, all the economic advantages that would come from not being under a sanctions regime. That's the thinking behind it. But this, you could argue, hasn't worked. Sanctions started 15 years ago, and North Korea has continued to develop its nuclear weapons program, and it has continued to do it even during the pandemic, right? So now we have North Korea has ICBMs that reach all the way to the US. So at least in theory, we don't know in practice, but at least in theory, North Korea could launch a nuclear strike on the US as a potential retaliation. For example, if there is an attack from the US. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but theoretically, this could actually happen. And of course, North Korea could easily, with its current short-range missiles, launch a nuclear strike on South Korea, on Japan. So that we know is possible. And of course, there are American troops in these two countries. So you could actually target American troops in these two countries. So North Korea has continued to develop its nuclear weapons program. I think if you talk to anyone dealing with North Korea or studying this issue, they will tell you North Korea is not going to denuclearize anytime soon. You can never say never. You know, who knows in 20, 30 years if it's a very different North Korea, like Kazakhstan did in the 1990s, or they might be willing to denuclearize, but this is not going to happen anytime soon. So what you see now is this shift in policy, including by the Biden administration. I mean, South Korea was already there, and other countries such as China and Russia were also there, that they're taking a more realistic approach, which is we have to start with diplomacy, but not Trump-style diplomacy of, meeting once in Singapore and a few months later we meet again in Hanoi, but there is no work between, right? So nothing happens, and then you have a 2-3 hour meeting, and you come out with an agreement, right? You come out of the meeting with an agreement. Those of you who have worked on diplomacy will know this. That's not how diplomacy works, right? Diplomacy needs working level meetings in which one country presents its position, the other country presents its position, and then you reach an agreement, and then at the end, the leaders sign the agreement, right? And this is what you see the Biden administration trying, what we call sustainable engagement with North Korea at the working level, which is something that South Korea has been advocating again under the current administration, the Moon administration, since it came to power to 2017. And it seems that there is an agreement between the US and South Korea that this is the way to go, and that it will be possible to do this once the pandemic situation is better, in the sense that, as you know, North Korea has completely closed the borders. Foreign diplomats have had to leave North Korea. So we are waiting for North Korea to start to receive vaccines on the COVAX facility, maybe this autumn. So North Korea will feel more comfortable with opening up, and diplomats can actually travel overseas, because North Korean diplomats haven't left Pyongyang since the pandemic started. And North Korea was the first country to shut down the borders in January of last year. Before we were even talking about the pandemic here in Europe, they already shut down the borders because of the fear that the pandemic would spread to the country, right? And vice versa, North Korean diplomats overseas, like here in Spain, for example, or here in the UK as well, right? And in other European countries, they haven't actually been able to return to the country since last year, right? So what happens when diplomacy resumes? We will see that this diplomatic engagement will probably have three vortices. The first one is nuclear weapons, which will be the top priority for the US. The second one, a peace regime that will involve the two Koreas, the US, and China as well, because when the Korean War finished, as you know, without a peace treaty, with an armistice, China was one of the countries that signed the armistice, along with North Korea and the US, on behalf of the United Nations. So China would have to be involved. So there are probably going to be discussions about a peace regime that would put a formal end to the Korean War, but importantly, that would lead to inter-Korean reconciliation. And going back to what I discussed at the beginning of this meeting, probably would include also North Korea-US normalization, probably starting with people-to-people exchanges and eventually moving to embassies, liaison offices, and then embassies. And thirdly, a sustainable engagement process will involve economic support for North Korea. I am of the opinion that North Korea will be willing to roll back, not to completely denuclearize, but at least to roll back its nuclear weapons program. But of course, the international community will have to pay for it. And it won't be the US paying for it. It will be South Korea, it would be Japan, it would be, yes, the US putting some money here and there, but really it will be other countries really paying, essentially providing aid, investment to North Korea in exchange for its nuclear weapons program rollback, cap and rollback. That's what we talk about, right? But my last point, an engagement process, sustainable engagement process with North Korea is also going to involve accepting North Korea as it is, as a de facto nuclear power. De jure, North Korea is not going to be accepted as a nuclear power. The US is never going to do this, that's obvious. And well, South Korea and Japan are never going to accept this de jure. But de facto, we have been living with a nuclear North Korea since 2006, when it conducted the first nuclear test. So it's 15 years of nuclear North Korea. So de facto, there is an acceptance in many countries, and you see this now with the Biden administration as well, that we have to live with a nuclear North Korea for the foreseeable future. Whether it's 10, 20, 30 years, who knows? But we cannot ask for denuclearization up front, because that's not going to happen. And to its credit, the Biden administration has been the first US administration that has said, yes, the ultimate goal is denuclearization, but the interim goal is an agreement to cap and roll back North Korea's nuclear weapons program. And this is a policy that South Korea actually, under the current government, supports as well. So I think that's where we are. right now. Robert, I'm going to leave it there for my initial presentation, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Ramon, thank you very, very much. What I suggest is as follows. We will begin. We have 15 people in the room, all included. I think that's about 10 or 12 audience members. The chat remains empty. So whilst you are priming your fingertips in the audience, putting your thinking caps on, I'm going to ask a couple of questions I'm going to kick off with. And the first one, let's focus a little bit more on the sort of key concepts of sovereignty, Ramon, if we may. I'm curious if you could give us your opinion about this idea that the way in which North Korea seems to be understanding the purpose of deterrent and the very physicality of sovereignty, that it's to do with non-intervention in its territorial space. And this, you gave us two sort of dynamics of what the nuclear arsenal provides. It's not only the physical destruction through an initiated war, but it's also this prevention of any intervention by Japan or South Korean or Americans under the pre-context of human rights promotion. If there was an uprising and the regime was under threat, the nuclear weapons would still be a stopgap. So on one hand, this is, as you phrased it, a Cold War understanding of sovereignty. And I juxtapose that with what you say is really the third economic goal, or it's the first and third objective together, which is normalization of relations with the US, which in your articles you talk about as being manifested in membership of the IMF, membership of the World Bank, Asian Development Bank. And if you couple that with this investment, it's essentially a very different but very clear way in which they will lose sovereignty as well, in the sense that it's this sort of argument Cuba always used, that their idea of protecting themselves from the US was that they would become an extension of America, and the Americanization, the marketization, commercialization. So I wonder, firstly, is that accurate? In the sense there's a kind of tension between what the sovereignty they're protecting on one hand and what the consequence of these other two policy main goals is. Secondly, tied to this very briefly, to what extent is this argument time dependent? Does it have an expiry date when one could say that China will become a more and more influential market in which they need to open to, which of course would go against your kind of narrative of longue durée? And very briefly, thirdly, do you think that the Trump position, having given Republicans a kind of a way to seeing that normalization with something in return could be possible? Do you think that in Congress now with Democrats, if Biden leads the Democrats and there's a rump of Republicans who can see it as a legacy of Trump, there might be a consensus? I will leave it there. If you want to begin that, there is already one question that's come up. So if we tackle that and a second one, go for those, and then we'll go through these other questions one by one. So take my one first, and then you can have some time and I'll read these.
Yeah, thank you. Because I mean, and the first one is really the core of the problem that North Korea has with itself, right? That, I mean, North Korea's biggest problem is of course South Korea. If South Korea didn't exist, North Korea could open up, no problem, right? But North Korea is very aware that if it opens up, the risk is that, and it becomes like China is today, for example, the risk is that at some point North Koreans will say, well, you know, we're living in a market economy. We have our neighbors, our brothers to the south, you know, we've been together as the same Korea for thousands of years, but you know, at the very least you could argue Korea as a single country goes back to the 10th century, you could argue, right? So why are we still a separate entity? Why don't we reunify or at least reconcile and have, as some people say, freedom of movement, right, between the two Koreas, right? Some people talk about the Irish model for Korean, not reunification but reconciliation, right? So yes, you could still have the two different countries, right? In this case would be Northern Ireland, of course, part of the UK and Ireland, right? But obviously there's a free movement of people, at least the ones until Brexit, right? So in Korea, people are starting to think in these terms, right? We might be two separate countries, but people can move more or less freely between the two of them. Now the problem here for North Korea is, of course, that they will move to South Korea, right? Most people will move to South Korea because it's richer. And that's the issue here. Now, on the other hand, and this is why it's important that you mentioned China, the risk that North Korea has is that it has become an economic appendix of China. So even though it claims that it is once its sovereignty protected and it doesn't have outside intervention, we do know that 90% of the North Korean economy is dependent on China. I mean, how many countries? That's the levels that you see. You mentioned Cuba, right? That's the level that you see with Cuba, right, before it became a communist country, and the U.S., or that you see with many smaller states in the European Union, right, in Europe, right, that are dependent on the European Union up to 90% for their economy, right? And North Korea knows this, and North Korea doesn't like this, because if you look at Korean history, you have throughout history, Korea wanted to be independent from Japan, but also from China, right? And it wanted to remain independent. And from North Korea being economically dependent on China is a really big problem. And that's something that South Korea and the US is trying to play on, right? They're trying to play on this. You will remain sovereign in the sense that, you will remain your political system. We're not trying regime change here. The Kim family, at least in the beginning, or at least officially, can remain in power. But look, economically, imagine you can get investment from South Korea, from Japan. Of course, Russia would invest as well, as it is already doing, but it could increase investment. You had in the past, you saw the mobile phone network in North Korea. It was developed by an Egyptian company together with a Singaporean company. So, there are potential investors in North Korea that cannot invest in the country because of the sanctions regime, which makes North Korea not sovereign in economic terms at all, right? It makes it dependent on China. It makes it a Chinese province, right? So going back to your point, is this time dependent? Yes, I mean, in the sense that as time goes by, North Korea becomes more and more dependent on China economically. And this is the insecurity on which the US and South Korea are trying to play on. And I think Trump, for all his faults, he got this right. He got this right, that this is the insecurity that North Korea has. And he gave Kim Jong-un the famous DVD with a resort, a Trump resort, right, in the coastline of North Korea. But that's what he was trying to promise. But to be honest, that's what South Korea has been saying under the current administration. Look, why don't we reconcile, and you have all these inter-Korean economic projects? I mean, in Japan, it's very interesting because in Japan there is a lot of pressure from business associations if North Korea opens up to invest there, right? Because they see how Japan can benefit as well, right? And these are the two sovereignties, right? The jure sovereignty, you're an independent country, but then the facto sovereignty that North Korea, you could argue, doesn't have now, right? And that's what the international community, I think, is going to try to play on, to try to reassure the Kim Jong-un regime that we don't want regime change. You're not going to be a new Gaddafi, right? That signed the agreement with the US and then was removed from power, right? So that's not going to happen, right? And the way normalization is being sold is in these terms as well, right? You normalize relations with the US, you're actually more sovereign in the sense that you are like every other country in the world that has diplomatic relations with the United States, right? So that's the way it's being sold. And this is the dilemma that North Korea has. This is the dilemma, which my impression, and I think you talk to most people who deal with North Korea, is that it remains unsolved, because it all sounds very good on paper, but again, at some point, when the North Korean economy has opened up, we have seen it with Vietnam, we have seen it with China, right? Similar communist countries that open up their economy. Well, you cannot close down again your economy. It would be impossible for the Vietnamese government or for the Xi Jinping government to say, okay, you know what, we're going to reverse trade and investment. We're going to go back to the way we were before 1978 or 1995 in the case of Vietnam, right? That's not possible. Which takes me to the second question, because that's what Biden has been doing. Biden has been very clever, of his administration, in saying we acknowledge the Singapore statement because that's a Trump statement, so it's a Republican statement. And there was an internal discussion. I mean, I have a very good friend actually who's working now for the Biden administration on these issues, right? And there was a very big discussion internally in the Biden administration. But on this issue, they said, well, politically, because of Congress, which is what you were talking about, it makes sense to say, look, we're building on something that a Republican president signed, and that, let's face it, if Trump had won a second term, he would be building on this, right? So they will say, okay, we're building on this. And politically makes sense because for the Democrats, it's something they can agree on. And there is a movement inside the Democratic Party that predates Trump that wanted to prioritize peace over nuclear weapons. And this has become bigger and bigger, right? It has become bigger. So in the Foreign Affairs Committee recently, there was a discussion, and the Foreign Affairs Committee agreed, passed a resolution, right, that now has to be voted by the whole of Congress, right, in which it would require the US government to reach a peace agreement with North Korea, right? So there is this move already in Congress in that direction that could be reinforced by Biden by building on the Trump agreement, absolutely.
Thank you. What I'm going to do, there are 5 questions here. Instead of, I'm going to summarize 3 of them first and then 2 of them second on. So what I'd like to do is this. The first question is from Emma, and she's now rejoined. She's gone out very briefly. It relates to the fact that, do you think that post-presidential elections in South Korea, there will be an opportunity to bring about, the question is, do you think any of the potential candidates can bring about a change in relations between the 2 Koreas? Building on that, Jin Ying has asked, do you think that a unified Korea in the peninsula that is a nuclear power could exist? So reunification, but keeping that central element of the North. And thirdly, this coming in from Victoria, do you think that the idea, what do you think of the idea that the North Korean regime will exist as long as the Chinese Communist Party remains in power? So if you take those 3, and then we'll focus a little bit more on human rights and domestic civil society in the next couple of questions.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. And actually, it's quite good to be able to discuss this because we're getting now in depth into issues that are happening as we speak, right? So the elections in South Korea is very interesting because the 2 previous conservative governments, they prioritize sanctions over talks. And clearly the current government is prioritizing talks over sanctions. And it has to be said that towards the end of the PAC government, before Moon came to power, even many conservatives were being critical because North Korea continued to develop its nuclear weapons program, right? So the discussion was, why are we imposing sanctions on North Korea that are ineffective? And we are somehow forgetting that, you know, according to the South Korean constitution, the ultimate goal is to be a unified Korea under the South Korean regime, right? Under the democratic regime. We have forgotten about this. So it's early days, but you don't see you don't even see conservative governments arguing to go back to what we had before. They do want talks. They might not trust the North Koreans, but they're not the only ones. Many liberals don't trust North Koreans either, right? But they do think that diplomacy is necessary, and I think this matters because whoever wins on the the primaries among the liberal candidates is going to pursue a very similar policy to Moon. I don't think that Moon is particularly liberal, actually. There are candidates more to his left that if they win, they will really push reconciliation much more than Moon has done, including potentially breaching the sanctions regime, which Moon hasn't done. But if you look at the conservative potential candidates, some of them, again, is arguing for going against dialogue, right? So going to your question, is there going to be a change in relations? I don't think this is going to be an area where there is going to be much change in relations, regardless of who wins next year. But it depends on North Korea as well. You know, if next year, you know, let's say in the spring of next year, North Korea conducts a nuclear test, well, whoever wins in South Korea is going to be very difficult to say, okay, let's move on with reconciliation. We're going to see a situation in which South Korea will double down on implementation of sanctions, right? Because that's what the South Korean population is going to demand. And there is a second issue here, and I touch on this, which is what do South Koreans want? And regardless of whether you're liberals or conservative, most South Koreans support engagement. They might differ on the extent to which engagement should be pursued, right? Does it include economic engagement? Is it only about people-to-people exchanges? shall we wait until North Korea starts to roll back its nuclear weapons program? But a large majority, around 2/3 of South Koreans, they do support engagement. So for South Korean politicians, it makes sense to support engagement because, voters, that's what they want, right? So even for, let's say, more narrow-minded political reasons, they will do that. And there's one third interesting issue here, which is we shouldn't discount the possibility of an agreement between Biden and North Korea before the South Korean election next year, in the spring of next year. It could be that this autumn or maybe even early next year, we see an agreement between the US and North Korea. And any South Korean president would support that agreement, right? So it might be that whoever wins next year, their hands are tied in the sense that, well, there's an agreement that will probably say, we all know what the agreement is going to say, denuclearization in exchange for economic support plus normalization. All the agreements say the same. This is nothing new, right? So any South Korean president will say, yes, I support this agreement. And so that will tie their hands, really. And the second question is, I find it very interesting because the idea of reunification with nuclear weapons is something that, as you can imagine, there have been discussions about this in South Korea, right? It's not a mainstream discussion. It's not a mainstream discussion for two reasons. A, what I mentioned before, international law, right? So in the same way that Kazakhstan, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because it was an independent country, legally, it couldn't retain the nuclear weapons, right? Because the nuclear power was Russia, not Kazakhstan. It would be very difficult for any South Korean or unified Korean government to say, okay, we're going to keep the nuclear weapons against international law. A, because you would assume that sanctions would be imposed on Korea, right? So the international community would say, well, the sanctions that were imposed on North Korea because of its nuclear weapons program now are going to be imposed on Korea, right, as the country that has inherited the nuclear weapons. And obviously no Korean government would accept this. And B, it would be very difficult because the fear from a unified Korea under possession of nuclear weapons is that A, the alliance with the US probably would be over because the US wouldn't accept an alliance with a Korean that is nuclear, right? Which B would probably lead Japan thinking, well, we are the only country in the region without nuclear weapons, so what are we waiting for, right? China has them, Russia has them, Korea has them, unified Korea. So we are the next ones in line, right? So that's another fear from a Korean perspective. They have 4 nuclear powers plus the US, obviously, nuclear umbrella in the region. So politically, it would also be very difficult for any Korean government to accept this. Having said that, because if reunification happens, or when it happens, I think it will happen, but we don't know how. One country, two systems. There are many different formulas, right? Two countries with freedom of movement. This will, in the future, we're talking really about 20, 30, 40 years here. What they always say in Korea, I mean, who knows by then? Who knows by then? I mean, it's a worst-case scenario, but we might have 2 or 3 nuclear powers in the Middle East because we haven't been able to solve the Iranian nuclear issue, and then Saudi Arabia decides to go nuclear. It might be that by then, the US has decided to somehow retreat from the nuclear umbrella, right? Because, there are these calls in the US to think more about domestic issues and not necessarily to think about allies, right? Or we might have a new Trump, as they say in Korea and Japan, actually, a clever Trump that pursues the same policy, but is clever in political terms, and who says, look, I don't want these alliances. They're a drain on American on American financial resources. So I don't want an alliance with South Korea and Japan. It's too expensive. So under this scenario, a unified Korea could say, well, we don't have an alliance with the US. There are other countries that are nuclear powers, and they continue to exist. So we might keep them. And there are Koreans, I would say more right-wing, I have to say, that believe that it might not be a bad option, a unified Korea with nuclear. Interestingly, there are also some Koreans on the left wing. So this is one of these areas in which it might not be a bad idea to have that. But right now it's very, very, very unlikely. So it's not that no one is thinking about it. And the question about China is, I find interesting because if China had wanted North Korea to collapse, that would have been the 1990s. And China could have easily done it. When we had the Great Famine that I mentioned before, the Arduous March, when millions of North Koreans perished, China could have opened the border. Yes, it's true. Many North Koreans would have crossed the border, but we're talking about a country with a population of over a billion people, right? Does it really make a difference if 2-3 million North Koreans cross the border and stay there for a while? China could have done this. China decided not to do this, and also was one of the countries that provided economic support to North Korea, right? South Korea, the US, European Union as well, actually, Japan, several countries provided economic support to North Korea. And then afterwards, China decided to create and invest in North Korea, right? So I think we can all agree that China has no intention of stopping its economic support to North Korea. Now, let's imagine that we have a new Chinese leader that thinks that yes, it wants to stop economic support to North Korea because it is a drain. And actually, Xi Jinping, it took him many years to meet with Kim Jong-un. He actually met first with the South Korean president, right? With the South Korean presidents. So he met with several South Korean presidents before meeting with Kim Jong-un, because we know he doesn't like North Korea. He doesn't like Kim Jong-un personally, right? So let's imagine in the future that a new leader such as Xi Jinping comes to power, but he says, look, really, forget about North Korea. If the US promises to remove its troops from a unified Korea, let them unify under a South Korean system, right? These are discussions, by the way, that are taking place. This is not science fiction, right? And then we go back to nuclear weapons. That's why North Korea wants nuclear weapons, because North Korea doesn't trust China, and we all know this. Doesn't trust China. It thinks that China betrayed North Korea twice: A, in the 1970s when it opened up its economy; B, in 1992 when it normalized relations with South Korea. And there's a very famous editorial by the Nodon Sinmun, the North Korean press, in which essentially saying, okay, fine, we can go our own way, right? If China wants to normalize relations with South Korea, up to them. But we're not, we don't trust you anymore, we'll go our own way, right? So that's why North Korea has the nuclear weapons, because it doesn't trust China. And China, and behind closed doors, has made clear to the US that if North Korea would launch a second Korean War, it wouldn't intervene. It's different if South Korea or the US try to invade North Korea. But if North Korea invades South Korea, or decides wants to invade South Korea again, China has made very clear behind closed doors that it won't support North Korea, right? So even though they have the formal alliance, it doesn't apply under the circumstances. So I think that yes, China could at some point potentially decide, okay, we don't want to provide any more support to North Korea, but it would be possible for North Korea to survive, or the regime, sorry, not the regime, the Kim regime to survive because of possession of nuclear weapons, because no country would dare. I mean, the first country that would say don't even dare to try to launch a strike on North Korea would be South Korea, for obvious reasons, right? I mean, with Japan closely second saying don't do that, because the first retaliation is going to be against Seoul and Tokyo, right? Plus American troops, of course, right? And that's where we are. That's why North Korea wants the nuclear weapons program, right? Because it doesn't trust really anyone, including China.
Right. Thank you, Ramon. That's very, very comprehensive. And it's so fascinating the way everything is kind of tied together. I'm going to try and do the same with 3 more questions. One of them is a little bit to stand aside. So the first one is the very first question that we had, and it's regarding the comments that you made about the Arab Spring and the revolutions in Eastern Europe. And it says many academics are pointing to the Jangma gangs, pronunciation probably terrible on my part, as the seeds for North Korean civil society and hinting at something like that in the country. So what are the chances of North Korean Spring and civil society? So that's the first question. I think related closely is one by Oksana, and she is asking you to draw out a little bit more the question or the parallels between Cuba and North Korea. And what she's getting at is why Cuba seems to be more attentive to human rights issues than North Korea. She says specifically, why do you think the international human rights regime has been able to reach and positively affect Cuba, but not North Korea? And could you elaborate slightly on that? And a third point, which is interesting because it's related to issues of norms and the localization perhaps of norms and values, is from Isabel, and she asks, is there a role for ASEAN in this, in terms of, she asks, let me find the best one. With regard to previous encounters between North Korea and ASEAN and the organization's principles of non-interference, do you think that ASEAN could play an important role in the reconciliation of North and South? And I think we'll leave it with those three questions because your work is more than cut out answering them, but please address them as you see fit.
Yeah, thank you. They're very interesting questions as well. And the Chamadan is, yes, it's a fascinating question because Kim Jong-un, the reason why he engaged in his economic, they don't call it reform of Korea, they call it more economic improvement policy, right? Is because he had to acknowledge the Chamadan, right? He had to acknowledge that the North Korean economy had changed. His father started to do this, as I said, going back to July 2002, but really under his father, there was still quite a bit of repression of the market economy. Some reforms were rolled back, so they were implemented, and then they were rolled back. And he didn't have that much time, right? Because by 2009, we know now that he was quite sick, right? And even though normally he was in charge of the country, he wasn't able to take all the decisions. So Kim Jong-un was the first leader who actually acknowledged this. And North Korea under Kim Jong-un has been willing, in private, not in public, to acknowledge the system of the Chamadan. As I said, it relates them to the fight against for independence against Japanese colonialism. And yes, I mean, the answer is yes, that this is, we don't know if a North Korean Spring, because North Korea has been very good at repressing its own population, and I will talk more about this when answering the second question. But it is true that the North Korean population has changed, and we know now, not only for who have left the country, at the border merchants, you know, that trade between China and North Korea, between both of them, that most North Koreans these days, their economic lives revolve around markets. They don't revolve, yes, still many men, for example, not women, but men have to go to factories, for example, but they do no work in the factories, right? Because there is no work to be done. So, for example, they bribe their managers so they can go to the market, or they produce some goods that they sell on the market, right? So this is the levels of marketization of the economy that we have, that even in the formal state-led economy, we see the market operating, right? I think that Kim Jong-un has shown that he might be willing to open up slightly the society and clearly the economy as well. And again, I think this is not necessarily because he wants to. We don't know if he wants to or not, but because he needs to, right? Because the North Korean economy needs the markets, and it needs a degree of openness that didn't exist before during the Cold War, right? And actually, this is, I think, what matters in the sense that we might not see an Arab Spring in North Korea, but we might see the regime having to engage in certain reforms because the society has changed and the economy of the country has changed. One of the reasons, I think we can all agree on this, if you follow these issues, why North Korea or the Kim Jong-un regime continued to develop the nuclear weapons program was potential for internal revolt and potential support from overseas. They talk a lot about Libya, how NATO countries supported the rebels that were fighting against Gaddafi. Even though Gaddafi had signed the agreement with the Bush administration to give up its weapons of mass destruction, right? North Koreans talk about this very often, right? Saying, well, we might sign an agreement with the US, but what happens if there's an internal revolt? Is NATO, something similar to NATO, right? Is the US, South Korea, and Japan going to support the rebels, right? Well, we need nuclear weapons, right? From a North Korean perspective, enemies are not only South Korea, the US, and Japan. They're also internal enemies. And again, I'll refer to this on the second question. And there's one last point about the Chamadan, which is quite interesting, that if you talk to the defectors who have left the country, right, or merchants who cross the border with China, actually they say the Chamadan is one of the reasons why not that many people are leaving the country to begin with, right? They're not trying to defect from the country because now they can make a living. So there's an acknowledgement that the standards of living have improved in North Korea under Kim Jong-un. Of course, very far away from what we see in China, never mind Japan or South Korea, but they have improved. And this is thanks to the Chamadan. So in a sense, the Chamadan have helped to suppress the potential revolt that you would see if we see the famine that people suffer in the 1990s, because in the 1990s, North Koreans didn't know how much richer was South Korea or China, right? Now they know because of all the smuggling taking place, right, into the country of DVDs, etc., etc. So this is a way of control of potential revolt, right? But no one can discount it, certainly because we don't know enough about North Korea. The question of what I find very interesting, because I'll give you the answer that North Korea gives, right? Because we do discuss human rights when you meet with North Koreans, right? They say, well, we are at war. This country is not at peace, we're at war, which is technically true, right? Because it is an armistice, not a peace agreement that put an end to the Korean War. Therefore, we have to protect ourselves against internal enemies, right? It goes back to the point that I made before. The enemies are not only the US or Korea or South Korea, right? We have internal enemies. Who are the internal enemies? Well, there are several. There are those families whose ancestors, right, they fought for South Korea. So you might have heard of this, but North Korea classifies people into three groups, right? The core, which are those that fought with the Communist Party for independence, and then in the Korean War. Then there is a second group which is neutral, right? They live in the country, and then there's a third group which are the enemies, right? And the enemies include, as I said, those that fought the Korean War on the South Korean side, but obviously these days we're talking about their descendants, right? So the children and the grandchildren, right? Enemies are also those that descend from landowners in North Korea. So this goes back to independence, right? So again, not only the landowners that today obviously they are gone, but their children and grandchildren, right? And also those that the North Korean regime claims that are enemies. There might be those caught watching a South Korean DVD, for example, a South Korean drama. Those caught smuggling drugs, for example, right? So that's the answer that North Korea gives, right? We have these internal enemies. Therefore, you cannot compare our human rights to those of any other country that is not at war, right? Because we have to protect our regime. In practice, other than the official explanation, human rights repressions, in my view, in North Korea is stronger because of the problem that we have mentioned, because South Korea exists, there could be a revolt, right? Very unlikely, but it could happen at some point. And for North Koreans, there is a clear example, which is South Korea. Again, it's not even China the example, it's South Korea, right? North Korea could become. So the regime will be very controlling in a way that other countries might not be as much as because of this reason. I think that any negotiation process with North Korea will involve discussions about human rights, because the change that Kim Jong-un brought was that he was willing to discuss human rights, something his father was not willing to do. Obviously with a very North Korean approach to human rights, which we don't agree with very clearly, international community, but he was willing to acknowledge that there are discussions about human rights. And interestingly, in North Korea, you can approach human rights in two different ways. A, if you talk about rights of particular groups, so let's say, for example, the human rights of the disabled, North Koreans are very willing to discuss this. How do you improve the situation of the disabled population, right? And they have engaged with this in the United Nations, and they have engaged with the third countries. Or if you talk about social rights as opposed to individual rights, right? And you talk about economic development of the society, right? But these are entry points that can help the international community to discuss human rights, because North Korea is willing to discuss these issues. And on the role of ASEAN, it's very interesting because the current South Korean government thinks that ASEAN could play a role. And it has tried to encourage ASEAN to play a role in three ways. A, because ASEAN countries have diplomatic relations with North Korea. And some of them have good relations, such as Vietnam, right? The relations between the Vietnamese Communist Party and the North Korean Communist Party are very good. And they are obviously decades-old relations. So it's a way to bring North Korea out of isolation, right? To engage with ASEAN countries that are more neutral. And this explains why the summits with Trump were in Singapore and in Hanoi, right? Because ASEAN countries are neutral. And we shouldn't forget that after the Hanoi summit, Kim Jong-un actually stayed in Vietnam for a state visit, right? So this can be a way of bringing North Korea out of the, from a South Korean perspective, this can be a way of bringing North Korea out of the isolation in which it is encountering. Secondly, because some countries can serve as a model for economic reform. And even going back to the Bush years, there was talk about Vietnam as a possible economic reform example for North Korea. There wasn't much talk about China because China is a completely different beast, right? It's the biggest economy in the world, the biggest country in the world by population, second biggest economy in the world. You cannot really compare North Korea and China in terms of a scale. You can compare them in terms of their reforms that they could include, but North Korea is more similar to Vietnam, right? To Vietnam in terms of a scale. So as I said, even during the Bush years, I remember some of the interviews I did back then, Bush officials were saying, you know, we could look at Vietnam as a possible economic example for North Korea. Some people also talk about Myanmar before the recent crackdown by the military regime. But you know, when there seemed to be some incipient economic and democratic reforms, until last year, some people were talking about Myanmar as another potential example for North Korea. So this was discussed as well, right? How ASEAN could help North Korea in this sense. And the third way in which ASEAN could be involved is, I mentioned before, through investment. So in the past, Singaporean companies have invested in North Korea. Malaysians are some of the few people in the world that can actually visit North Korea without a visa, or they could until the recent political problems between both of them. So North Korea has better relations with countries in ASEAN, and there are countries in ASEAN that might be willing to invest in North Korea, right? It's a risky proposition, but it's risky for anyone. And you know, there could be companies from Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and of course Singapore that could decide that this is a good investment option. So ASEAN could play a role, not the main role. So they will have the core countries, South Korea, US, obviously China, but then there could be a second circle of countries, and that would include ASEAN. Well, the United Nations would be involved as an institution, probably the European Union, maybe Australia as well. So you have this second ring of countries that could help North Korea as well.
Right, Ramon. I think you're getting a lot of messages of thanks in the chat bar. I think everyone who's asked a question has had their question very thoroughly answered. You've done it with this breadth of knowledge which interacts between the domestic and the international, the historical, and also the regional context in which everything is placed. It is fascinating to listen to you speak. Thank you so much for your time today. We've gone just over an hour and 15 minutes, so I think it's more than enough we've asked of you. Hopefully, who knows when, maybe next year when you mentioned to me that you might be traveling to Barcelona, we could have you here in person, and that would be fantastic as well. But in the meanwhile, from everyone here who's been listening, anyone who might be watching the video afterwards who couldn't attend in person, I think I would express sincerely on behalf of all of them our thanks to you, and we wish you a very lovely remainder of your Monday. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. It has been great. Thanks a lot.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye.